So welcome back everybody to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Sylvain Chassang with us from Princeton. Hi Sylvain.
Hi.
Good to see you. Today Sylvain will talk about keep, cut, commit, an alternative path to the decarbonization of car use. And today we talk about global climate change and how we can make a better use of a better policy to decarbonize the car use. So essentially, when we emit carbons, we have a lot of sectors which emit carbons, and one of them is the transportation sector. It's not the biggest sector, but it's a big sector. We have to make sure that CO2 emissions are not too dramatic. And the key essentially is to get a smart transition going. So the objectives for the car industry is, of course, it's the dilemma. They have technological change. The China market is breaking away. There are big challenges going on. And often we focus on the final scenarios and we don't really focus on the transition phase. And I think the transition phase is actually the most important thing to get to the final scenarios. And the question is how to replace the old dirty capital with a new green capital stock. And of course we can go the slow way. The slow way is to say we wait until the capital is depreciated and then we replace it with a new capital, some green capital. So when the machine or the car breaks down, we replace it with a green, more climate-friendly car. A faster transition, of course, says, okay, we have to actually get rid of the old car earlier, even if the car can be still used and is still useful as a capital, but we have to just discard it and replace it with a new green technology right away. Of course, this leads to a lot of waste, and this hits often poor households, so it also has a redistributive feature to that. What Sylvain will talk about, and I hope, is that he will talk about a smart transition where we reallocate the capital in a clever way so that we can achieve the CO2 objectives without throwing so much of the existing capital stock away. And so we're looking forward to what Sylvain proposes. His proposal is called Keep, Cut, Commit. And we're looking forward to see how it works. So Sylvain, the floor is yours. Thanks for doing it, and thanks for presenting us your idea. It's great that you're working on this, doing something which saves the environment, but also is economically sensible.
All right, thank you so much, Markus. So a few disclosures. So this is work that I did as part of an appointment with the French Council of Economic Analysis. This is a pro bono appointment, so this is work that I don't get paid for. And it's also work that the French government doesn't have a right of control over. So we just publish what we think is right. But it's work that was presented to the government and that's written so that it kind of has a chance to fly within the French political and economic context. Two of the things that this appointment brings is the partnership with organizations, in particular with the French Consumer Defense Association, UFC Que Choisir, that helped us with a household survey, and with the French Public Investment Bank that helped us run a corporate survey. So although what I do is sort of done on a faster time span than typical academic research, we still got to do some original fact-finding through these surveys. I can tell you about, in short, what was the objective and what we achieved. Again, the objective, so when Markus said, transport is not big, well, individual transport is roughly 15% of French CO2 greenhouse gases emissions, and that's roughly the same across OECD countries. And it's a problematic sector because it's the sector whose emissions have not reduced. So Europe, to a first order, has been reducing greenhouse gas emissions by about 1% a year since 1990, right? So we've been making progress. Transport is the sector that has remained stable. All the other sectors have figured out ways to reduce their emissions at a rate of roughly, a bit more than 1% a year. Transport is the one that has not been successful. So the objective is to reduce emissions by, let's say, an order of magnitude of 10 to 15% within the next 5 years, and in a context that's very constrained. So it needs to have a limited cost to users, car users, car manufacturers, and public finances, right? And the two economic forces that end up taking an important place in the analysis is the used car market, right? When if I have an old car that has $7,000 of residual value, it's not going to get trashed, right? Like, you know, we don't have incentive schemes in which the government is paying $7,000 for those cars. It's too expensive, it's not affordable. And the usage that people make of their car, right? So now I have I own an ICE car, but I don't drive it much, okay? That's a variable that's going to play an important role. I'm going to make a few economic analysis points about these determinants of the efficiency of policies. There are going to be three simple takeaways that I sort of, package into what I call an individual action plan. That's keep, cut, commit. The keep is if you drive an ICE car, so a combustion engine car, less than the average, and here that's significantly less. So in the European context, that would be 8,000 kilometers a year. If you drive less than 8,000 kilometers a year, you're in the bottom 30% of the population, the bottom 33% of the population in terms of how much you drive. Then you just keep it. You are the best possible owner of a combustion engine car. In the US context, you switch kilometers for miles, 8,000 miles, that would be the equivalent in the US context. People just drive a lot more in the US. Okay, so I don't guilt myself if I have an ICE car, provided that I don't drive in much. I'm the best possible owner of an ICE car. However, I can do something about my emissions. I can cut how much I use my car now. And there are many ways to do this, because it's not so much the car use you want to reduce, it's the fuel consumption. And you can just do that by saving a little bit on your fuel consumption. I'll propose some strategies for that. One of the important things is that this is quite effective because it's a strategy that can be implemented at the scale of the entire fleet of cars, whether they are battery electric or hybrid, or they are just used old polluting ICE cars. And it's a strategy that can be done right now. And this complementarity between taking action right now at the scale of the fleet has a really important effect, even if the reduction is relatively small. So I'm talking about a 10% reduction in use. And the next one, I'm going to clarify that a little bit later, so I won't insist on it now, is to formulate a commitment that your next car, when you do decide to change your car, that next car, whether used or new, will be electric. Okay?
But we know that the electric car is the right thing to do if you drive very little. It might be
okay.
Production is more climate damaging than
combustion. So I can talk about those details, so we can sort of get into the weeds of this. There are multiple aspects there.
Let's postpone it.
Okay. It depends on where you live, because it depends on how clean your grid is. In France is one of the best places in the world to have electric cars because our electricity is relatively carbon-free. The rest of Europe will depend on where you are. The trends, the trends for renewables have been very good. I think solar has surprised everybody, even people that weren't particularly impressed, 10 years ago. And I think, it's probably going to be the case as well in the rest of Europe. Whether you drive a lot or you drive less, it depends kind of where. Cities, so even if you don't drive a lot but you drive in cities, traditional ICE cars, not hybrids, not good hybrids, but traditional ICE engines are not very good because they have really low efficiency in cities, so there's an argument to at least partially electrify them for people who drive in cities, even if you don't drive a lot. And if you could switch from electric to electrified, and I as a person would not be horrified. My more intense colleagues might be, but I would live with that. I'm going to tell you a few facts about the French car market. They are qualitatively similar for the majority of OECD countries. And the main takeaway is that the used car market is big and important and liquid. That's going to be the big takeaway. The second big takeaway is that usage is very heterogeneous across car drivers. Some facts about first stocks and flows. So the French fleet is about 40 million cars. The US fleet is, 8 times that. And it's been growing and aging. So it's been increasing by 1% a year, and it's been aging by a bit more than that, by 20% over 10 years. So it's not a fleet that's in a stationary state. It's still growing. The inflows are roughly 2 million a year. That's 5% of the fleet. That's important because it's saying that we're not renewing the fleet very fast. To completely renew the fleet, it would take 20 years. And right now, EVs, pure battery EVs, are a little under 20% of renewals. Right? So the speed at which you're going to renew the fleet, at which you're going to decarbonize transport just by renewing the fleet to EVs is going to be relatively slow. Really speaking, even in 2050, in our calculations, you still have between 15 to 20 million ICE cars that are on the street, are running on the street. The second fact I want to highlight is that the used car market is big. So it's roughly 6 million cars a year, and it can go, plus or minus 1 million depending on the year. So it has a fair capability of, absorbing changes in supply and demand. Okay, that's going to be important in a minute because that's going to be a fairly liquid market. The second set of facts I want to highlight is that usage is heterogeneous. So 25% of the population drives less than 6,000 kilometers a year. 25% drive more than 15,000 kilometers a year. And you multiply this, you change kilometers to miles, and something similar is true in the US. Right? So that means that you have, and this is also true controlling for characteristics of the car, controlling for the age of the car, controlling for the size of the car. There's still a lot of heterogeneity. What that means is that the same car could be driven by someone who doesn't drive a lot, 6,000 kilometers a year, or by someone who does drive a lot. Okay? And that means that there is going to be some action to the match between the owner of the car and their usage of the car and the type of the car you have. There are good matches. So for instance, hybrid cars tend to be driven 40% more than traditional gas cars. Okay, that's a good match. The more polluting car is being driven significantly more. There are bad matches. So there are a lot of diesel cars that are driven in Europe. They tend to be driven a lot. Okay, so they tend to be driven a lot more, say, than electric cars. Okay, so that's an example of a bad match. And so one of the goals of policy, and I'm going to argue that it's a goal that can be achieved at a low cost, is to shift the ownership of these, highly polluting, highly driven cars to people who don't drive them quite as much. And you can do that by acting on people's investment renewal behavior.
But a diesel car is probably better than a gasoline car because it uses fewer liters of diesel and CO2.
But it depends on the way you use them. So I think one of the interesting aspects of the question is that, details matter quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think it's probably true that if you are looking at people who drive significantly more than, let's say, 25,000 kilometers a year, so people who are going to who drive, let's say, more, between 1 and 200 kilometers every day, most of that is going to be a lot of that is going to be highway driving. And then diesel car might be optimal for those uses, right? Because, EVs tend to get worse with sort of long distance driving. The usage proposal gets worse. The constraints of finding the time to recharge them get worse. And so you could imagine that there is a sliver of people with really, really intense usage for whom a traditional diesel car that's very well tuned will remain the right strategy even in the medium run. And so that I think is true. And I think that's one of the spaces where we could think of adjusting, fuel efficiency targets that the EU has set itself. So what's known as CAFE standards, but they're sort of very different across the US and the EU. So I don't like using CAFE as a word because I think it means something very specific in the US. But, now there are very strict goals, and that's a potential carve-out that you could have. At the same time, it's less liters of diesel, but diesel is just a lot more. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 points of economic analysis. The first one is related to some headlines that you may have seen in the news recently that car manufacturers are just not selling cars anymore. they've had some negative shocks. Not that they're not selling cars, they're still selling quite a lot of cars, but they're selling less than they used to, and that has them worried, especially in the context where they feel that they are, potentially losing market share within the next 5 years to new competitors. Right? There is a fundamental event that's happening. We're going through the automobile industry, whether it's car users or car manufacturers, are going through what's called an uncertainty shock. There is a lot more uncertainty about automobiles, about the next 5 years, than there will be in the long run. Right now, the industry is changing, and what that does is this uncertainty. And there are many reasons for this uncertainty. There's technological uncertainty. I don't know whether current EVs are going to be, are going to still look good in the next 5 years, or whether they're going to look obsolete and they're going to lose their value in the used car market. I don't know whether the politics will change and whether, the planned fuel efficiency standards of the EU are going to be dropped. And gas cars are going to be tolerated again. And then there's economic uncertainty, because in order for the transition to work, you need a lot of complementary investments, right? You need car manufacturers to design cars and make production investments at scale so that you have cars that people want and that don't cost too much. And then you need infrastructure operators to make investment in infrastructure so that you have charging infrastructure where you need it to be. And generation and transport infrastructure to have the electricity where you need it to be. And right now, people are very uncertain about the future of automobiles. One of the numbers that we get from our survey, which is sort of amusing and worrisome, is that 50% of households believe that both traditional combustion engine cars and EVs will lose value at an accelerated rate, will become obsolete faster than usual on the used car market. So people are, in some sense, depressed about every technology that exists, right? And 30% of the corporate, the small and medium firms that we talk to report that they're delaying the speed at which they're renewing their fleet in response to this political uncertainty, to this technological and political uncertainty, right? And so the implication here is, facing this uncertainty over the short to medium run, what do people do? Well, people delay their investments, right? Now, I could think of renewing my car now. Let's say I renew my car every 10 years. Now, I would be thinking about renewing my car because I'm uncertain about what regulation will apply, about what type of car I should buy, what technology will be the future. I'm going to delay a few years, right? Instead of buying a new car this year, I'm going to buy a new car in 2, 3, 4, 5 years so that I have time to see what is the best car for me to buy. Okay? And what that does is this is going to temporarily depress all new car demand. And it's important to highlight it's going to depress all car demand, not just demand of EVs, but it's also going to depress demand for traditional ICE cars. It might be okay for demand for, insurance type portfolios. You can think of a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid as an insurance portfolio. It's a little bit like a traditional car. It's a little bit like an EV. So you're hoping that it will lose less of its residual value on the used car market. It's a bit safer. But this uncertainty shock affects equally EVs and traditional ICE cars. What's important to notice here is it's a temporary event, right? I can't keep delaying buying a new car forever. At some point, my car will break down. At some point, I'm going to want a new car. And so what this is saying is that the current depression in demand will be followed by a pickup in demand, in the next 3, 4, 5 years. Okay?
So can I say that it's an uncertainty shock? I see that, but I can, on top of it, it's also the technological advancement in the electric car is actually so fast that I don't want to buy an old technology now. Wait for
I agree. I mean, in some sense, it's part of the, maybe we're certain this is a problem, but it's part of the shock, is that right now we are in a transition period and you're not sure whether the current technology is good enough to remain competitive with what the norm will be in 3, 4, 5 years. And so this idea that it's an investment delay, in part, it's good news, right? It's saying it's not that people are going to stop buying cars forever. It's saying that, maybe you're making less money now, but the demand will come back in a few years.
Have you looked at the Chinese data as well? Because in China the transition happened much faster. Is there the same uncertainty there, or they don't have this uncertainty?
So I think one of the things that the Chinese have been particularly good at is not putting political uncertainty and shortening the transition. So, in some ways, anything that lengthens the process and lengthens the transition causes people to delay more. Right? So if you have it planned as a process where, it's going to take until 2035, well, people are going to live with this uncertainty of whether, will government stick to it or not until 2035. The Chinese, right now, if you live in a big Chinese city and you want to have a combustion engine car, you have to be incredibly rich, right? Like, it's just much more expensive to be allowed to have a combustion engine car. And they're doing it not so much for GHG reasons, for greenhouse gas reasons, but they're doing it for local emissions, because that impact too.
To promote the own industry as well, I guess.
Also to promote them and so on. But I think at least along this dimension, they're better. They might have better coordination of incentives. I think they're having a government with a lot of power, basically, that can coordinate the action of economic actors, really helps in coordinating car manufacturers and infrastructure operators. They face the same technology obsolescence risk, right? Even more so maybe because, they have new technology and new software coming out, at a rapid pick over there. So that they face in the same way. One of the diagnostic points that is an uncertainty shock is this idea that when the French and the Germans reduced their subsidies, it didn't cause massive substitution to our traditional ICE cars, but sales of EVs drops, and sales of traditional ICE cars also kept dropping, right? So it's really not a substitution from one to the other. It's people want to delay, and we're trying to bribe them to buy something now, right? And this is why these subsidies cost so much, is because people really just ideally they'd like to wait a bit longer. And now the next point.
Across the premium class and the cheaper cars, is it across all types of cars, in a sense that expensive cars are delayed and not so expensive cars are delayed as well? Or is it more pronounced in some certain subsectors?
I don't have good information about this. So new cars, I think of new cars as kind of expensive cars because, most people in France who buy a car, they buy a used car.
Expensive Mercedes, BMW, or not so expensive?
I don't have an answer. I mean, I can tell you that there is less delay for hybrids because it's a safer technology, it's a compromised technology. So from the perspective of taking a bet on what the future of regulation will be, it's a safer bet. And I think those, are not hit by this delay, but both other categories are hit. I can't tell you about. I haven't looked at that particular question. Okay. Now the next question is this a problem for whom, and how can we plan around it? What's the cost of delayed investment? Potentially there is a cost for the environment. It's the idea that CO2 emissions impact temperatures with delay. The higher temperature we're facing today are associated with emissions from when I was a kid, from the 1980s to 2000s. And so if we want to make life better for our children and grandchildren, it's really much better to reduce emissions now. So in principle, you could think that it matters for people to renew faster. Okay, it turns out that because of the used car market and because when I switch from an ICE engine to an EV, I do not destroy my used car. I don't bury it in my garden. It gets sold via my dealership to somebody else. This is a margin that unfortunately is not moved a lot when people move their investment into a new car forward or when they delay investment. It turns out to be a margin that's not moved by people's by their timing decision, by the timing of renewal. It turns out to be a bigger problem for economic coordination, right? So low sales of EVs depress investment from manufacturers and infrastructure operators because they're worried. They put pressure on governments to change emission standards, and that in turn lowers investments in EVs, right? So you have this feedback loop where so that also lowers demand in EVs. So you have this coordination problem, which is if people start panicking that the transition is not going to go well, the transition is not going to go well, right? And so for that, it's necessary to create a strong signal of potential future demand That's going to be a key aspect of the recommendation. I'll come back to that in a second. You're trying to coordinate a difficult coordination exercise. About the used car market, which is CO2 leakage. When I renew my, I've also already mentioned this. So I own a used Toyota. It has, let's say, $8,000 of residual value. I'm feeling guilty about my emissions because I have children. I want to switch to an EV, right? Because it has, $8,000 of residual value, that car will actually be sold by my dealership and me to the used car market, right? So, unless I'm getting paid out for that car, or unless I value reducing my emissions by this much, I don't know anybody who has trashed their car, right? So even people on the news who've given up their Tesla, they don't trash their Tesla. Their Tesla is going to, be driven by someone else on the, who buys them on the used car market. People don't trash cars that have, $5,000 of residual value.
Right, so that's for clunkers. We did that. No, we took our cars out.
But it's at a very small scale and for old cars.
Yes.
And so there is a program that like that existed in France that's called the prime à la conversion, and that's actually a system that gets completely gamed when it's in stationary equilibrium. So that was a system where, provided your car was road legal and old enough, you could get paid out 5,000 euros for it. What that does is that just puts a floor on the value of a car that can drive on the road. Okay? It doesn't change your timing of getting rid of scrappage. There is empirical data that showed it didn't change the timing because I can basically keep driving it until I know it's about to fail the road road legality, and then I sell it to the government. I can get all the residual value of that car and also get the benefit. So you really need to have it as you get this one-time proposal when the car is old enough. So those systems need to be really properly designed to have an impact. And even then, it's horribly expensive. So that's a system that costs, hundreds of millions to the French government. Adaptation is a bigger issue at this point. If you're going to be spending billions on stuff, making sure that old people don't die of heat exposure is probably more important for governments. Okay. So let me keep going. So my car's direct emissions will keep happening with Priority 1. There could be indirect effects. So my car will be sold to someone who maybe will scrap their own even older car. Right? So there is my car gets sold to someone whose car maybe has $3,000 of residual value or $2,000 of residual value, and they'll choose to scrap it. Okay? And maybe that indirect effect is useful. And that's where the fact that the used car market is big and liquid is important, right? Because the used car market is big and liquid, the old car that I put on the market that's has $8,000 of residual value will not lower the residual value of even older car by much, and that means that the impact on scrappage is going to be small. Even taking into account these effects in the most optimistic way, the estimate is that at least 60% of the car's emissions are going to happen. That makes sense? And so what that means is that, a fair chunk, even with this net effect, a fair chunk of my car's emissions are going to happen regardless of what I do. What are the implications? If I'm a low mileage driver, in the European context, if I drive less than, roughly 8,000 kilometers a year, it is this completely counterfactual result where you're going to cause more emissions by not driving your car than by driving it, right? Because if you don't drive your car, if you have it, and you drive, let's say, 6,000 kilometers a year, you're basically paying a lot of money. You're paying for insurance costs. You're paying for the depreciation of your car to store metal in a garage, right? To immobilize steel, right? And so you're basically subsidizing the non-use of the asset. Right? And so the result here is that low mileage drivers are the best possible owners of ICE cars, right? Of combustion engine cars. And so if you don't drive much, the takeaway is don't feel guilty about owning a combustion engine. You tell your children that you're doing the right thing, and you keep it. For an average drivers, things are a little bit different. So for somebody in the European context who drives 12,000 kilometers a year, in the US context maybe 12,000 miles, what happens there is that the timing of renewal doesn't matter. It's better if when you switch, you do switch to an electric car. So, and it's okay for you to switch. But the timing, whether you switch now to an EV or you switch in 3 years to an EV, from the perspective of temperatures, that doesn't matter so much, right? In a sense, the main KPI here is not so much that EV sales are going up, is that traditional ICE sales are going down. If people are delaying investment, what's important is that they don't invest in the wrong asset.
KPI stands for?
Key performance indicator.
Okay.
Right. So when I talk it to the French, the various ministries, the environment people are really worried about drops in EV sales, and I tell them, well, sure, that's happening, but what you should focus on when you drop subsidies is, are you selling a lot more ICE cars? And the point is, when you drop subsidies, you're not selling a bunch more ICE cars. So at least the environmentalists should not care about that. The industry ministry will care about other things, but in terms of the environment, provided we're not selling ICE cars, it's already good news. Okay, there's another leakage I'll talk about very briefly via the used car market, but that matters for policy, and that matters for people's lives. It's the idea of subsidy leakage. So it's not possible to just subsidize the first owner of an EV in equilibrium, right? So when EV policies were first designed, there was no used EV car market, there was no EV market. And so they really wanted to have a big impact. They want to have a big sticker price impact on purchasers. So all the EV subsidies that exist in the world go to the first owner. In France right now, you can get 4,000 euros for the first owner, provided they drive 6,000 kilometers over a year, which a lot of people do. Right? The problem with that is that at historical depreciation rates, so let's say 20% the first year, 10% the second, 10% the third. In the US, you look at the Kelly Blue Book for that. But at those historical depreciation rates, if you have a big subsidy that goes to the first owner of a car over a few years, it becomes cheaper to own a new car than an old car. Okay, so that cannot happen for very long, right? If you have a situation like that, what happens is you have used cars that sit on dealership slots and don't get sold, right? At some point, the dealers are going to bring the prices down to sell their stock. And what that means is that in order to resuscitate the used car market, you're going to have an accelerated depreciation of used EVs once they don't get subsidies anymore, right? And the implication is that there is a mechanical impact of front-loaded subsidies on the depreciation of EVs. The magnitude is big. It's roughly 10 percentage points of depreciation. So right now they tell you, a 2-year-old EV is 40% depreciation. That's so much bigger than a used ICE car. But a used ICE car is like almost 30%, right? And so the gap is in large part a purely mechanical effect of the front-loaded subsidies. There's also an impact of, there's uncertainty about technology, so it's true that EVs face more technological uncertainty than ICE cars, but ICE cars face a fair amount of regulatory uncertainty. And so, a lot of that depreciation is a mechanical effect. In principle,
if you take the price before the subsidy, then it's the same. It's just if you take it off the subsidy, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But all those are calculated for the before price. Not everybody gets the subsidy, so it's not like all cars get subsidized. So the car that all the statistics are computed on is the first initial cost of the car. And so it's all in equilibrium. The estimates are that the first owner really only captures 20% of the subsidy's value. The rest of it goes to further owners of the car. But the problem is that these people don't realize that they're facing lower prices because of the subsidy. Right? Basically, these people make an inference that they're getting a car whose batteries are not very good. Right? That's the only reason why they would cost so little. So these people make an inference that the car that they're buying is not so good, and they have no
But
gratefulness.
This is an information problem. It's fair that actually somebody who buys the car in age 3 of the car also gets part of the subsidy because he drives it from...
No, that's fair. I think that's great. The problem is that they make the wrong inference from that. It's also that they're really not appreciative of subsidies. In our surveys, 70% of people tell us that they don't like the subsidies, that they only go to rich people. It's not true, right? The subsidies get passed on to the second buyer, third buyer of the car, but people don't realize that. And so the alternative...
The information campaign is actually what you're saying.
So you could do an information campaign. An alternative is to subsidize leasing instead. So in France, it's 80% of EVs get sold via leasing, right? And so you could just subsidize leasing. You could say, we're going to subsidize the cost of leasing EVs by 15%, regardless of the age of the EV. You associate the subsidy to the vehicle rather than associating the subsidy to the buyer. You can still have a sticker offer that says, oh, you're buying a lease, you're getting 4,000 euros worth of subsidies. It's just that they'll get passed on to the next buyer. And that no longer, accelerates the depreciation of the EV. So, and that also makes it clear to everybody that they're directly benefiting from government subsidies. So I think it's just a better way to do it.
It also takes out some of this uncertainty for the consumer, I guess.
Yes. And it's also the idea that you can subsidize. Early on, people really hated the idea of subsidizing used cars because they thought, those people somebody has already made the decision. And you can't do that in the short run because equilibrium effects are not there yet, right? So, there is no used car market that tells you what is the resale price. You're using historical Kelly Blue Book values. And so you're saying, at the 20% depreciation rate, let's just maximize the first price. But in equilibrium, people now realize that used EVs are depreciating faster, and so you're not getting the benefit of, focusing on the first buyer anymore. So we need to go to equilibrium policies, basically, on EV subsidies.
Yes.
So I'm almost done. What are the takeaways from that?
Can I just,
yes?
Is there, because it's an information problem, is there the redistribution between people who are well informed and can infer the equilibrium effects and people who cannot infer the equilibrium effect, or is it purely a perception thing that people can in your service you couldn't elicit anything?
I'm probably a pretty good Bayesian updater. I'm pretty good at inference. Yeah. And before working on this, I had never thought that. Okay. When I got a back deal, I thought, maybe it's because other people are worried and I'm not worried. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was because people were worried about uncertainty about the technology.
Yes.
But it's true. If anything, if there is this information friction happening, it's an information friction that's benefiting more savvy operators and hurting less savvy operators. Yes. So I think that's true. So it's redistributively not a good friction to have. Okay, so I boil this observation down to a proposal that has the advantage that a lot of the steps can be picked up at the individual level or at the corporate level, but basically with very, very little government support, which is useful in today's context across the globe, essentially. Maybe not China, but everywhere. It's either appetite for regulation is down or just funding for transition is down. And it's in 3 steps. So it's keep, cut, commit. The keep is, if I don't drive much, I'm the best owner of a combustion engine car, I keep it. And why is this really useful is that you stop redistributing cars from people who don't drive them to people who drive them a lot, right? The used car market is a big matching platform that switches cars from people who don't use them to people who use them more, right? And it's a big market. I told you it's 6 million cars a year. That's 15% of the overall fleet. That means that by changing this behavior so that now people who don't drive much keep their car, you reallocate cars from people who drive them a lot to people who don't drive them much relatively fast. So that's why this has an impact within 5 to 7 years, right? What margin are you change? Think of the person who's going to drive a lot and who needs a car. Now instead of buying my used Toyota, instead of buying a bigger used Toyota, let's say I drive a Camry, instead of buying a used Camry, they're going to buy a new Corolla. And that's a good change for them, right? So they're going to switch from a bigger, older car to a smaller, newer car that they can afford, right? So if you think of them as having a budget line, that's how they're going to express their budget, right? The second one is cut, and I've already given a number. Is I cut my current fuel use by 10%. And that's a small number in our surveys. It's more than 60% of people who tell us that they can do that at little effort. There are many ways to do it. That's what's nice. You can cut one trip out of 10. Another way to do it is just simply to drive more efficiently. There is a link to in the presentation. It's something that the French Postal Office, for instance, has optimized. So they've run large randomized control trials where basically a few tips get their postal offices to consume 10% less gas, and that's roughly by inflating your tires well and driving smoothly, basically. In order for these good habits to stick, another thing that I suggest is to switch to usage-based insurance. So there are very good usage-based insurance programs in the US where the amount you pay is related to the amount of driving you do. And it turns out to not be it's not an insignificant amount of money. And so you can sort of make those habits of driving less stick longer by switching to usage-based insurance. And the reason this is effective is that you get to act now across the entire fleet, right? And acting early, acting across the entire fleet, even for a little bit, has an impact that's commensurate to the accelerated electrification of new car sales, roughly to achieving the goals of electrifying 100% of new car sales by 2035. That's the goal of the EU. And the next action step is to commit that your next new car will be an EV. A new car, used car, it's okay. It's actually okay, whichever you choose.
It doesn't have to be an EV, it can be a hydrogen. Let's suppose we don't know which technology will be the most climate friendly. Should it be just something? Oh, okay.
I'm willing to say electrified. Hydrogen is complicated, so if
no, I'm not saying it could be some totally new technology, just CO2 friendly, low CO2, low emission.
I'm going to have a point for PHEVs because PHEVs get a lot of bad press, and this is a good opportunity for me to be on the record. The reason PHEVs, so plug-in hybrid vehicles, get a bad press is historically incentives to have them were very, very high. Right, so whether from a regulatory perspective, constraining corporations to buy them for their employees, or from a perspective of subsidies to individuals, the government action on them was very, very strong. And the result of very strong government action is that people who bought these PHEVs were buying them because of the incentives, not because they were planning to use them in a climate-friendly way. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, well, you have people who don't recharge their vehicles very often. And then you have people and those vehicles are heavy, and so they're worse. So it's a case of regulation and incentives making things worse. Because of that, the data we have about usage of PHEVs is very depressing. People buy them, they don't recharge them. In that use case, PHEVs are very bad. In my data, my household survey data, in which people were not really getting paid to use them, people use them well. If you're not getting government subsidies, if you're not constrained to use them, if they don't make it, if regulation does not encourage you to use them, then the people who buy those cars buy them and use them. They're more expensive, and they use them the way they're supposed to be used. So that's another point where the devil is in the detail. PHEVs can be good, but you need to monitor usage. So they're good if you don't give people incentives to buy them, and if you want to give people incentives to buy them, then you need to monitor usage. Sorry. That's going to be my last slide. It's really important to create this strong commitment to buying an EV in the next 3, 4 to 5 years to create a strong signal, because that's the data. If we have lower EV sales today, that's the data that's going to be used to reassure car manufacturers, that's going to be used to reassure financial markets, that's going to be used to reassure governments. So you need to get a strong signal. The good news is that you're just trying to get a signal of what people kind of wanted to do anyway within the next 3 to 5 years. You're not trying to get people to do something they don't want to do. Something that people don't want to do is buy an EV right now. Right? Instead, you're shifting to a different goal, which is to commit to tell you what they're going to do in the future. The proposal is this green savings plan, right? Think of it as, every month I'm saving between 50 to 200 euros. And instead of just getting the market rate on that, that's what I'm going to call Euribor. That's basically the safe rate in the EU. I'm going to get Euribor plus 3 percentage points. I'm reading 3% because that's what everybody understands, but it's really 3 percentage points for the next 3 years. Right, so that's pretty good. If I'm optimizing my savings, 3 percentage points looks pretty good above the market rate.
But who is paying the 3%?
Well, I'll come back to that. So 3 percentage points that lives multiple times within the margin that car manufacturers give their dealership networks, right? So right now, if you have basically a sales funnel that comes through this, that could live entirely by reducing the margin that you give dealerships because they bring you a new client. That makes sense? So it's not clear that you need government involvement for that. 3% on a car, on the sticker price of a car, is not a big number. Roughly, it's a tenth of the current subsidy. So 3% on 200 euros a month for 3 years, that's 400 euros. In exchange for that, increased savings, what do you get? Well, you have to commit to buy an EV within the next 3, maybe plus a few years if you want to be nice. And the benefits get lost if you don't purchase. It's not that you lose your savings, you keep your savings. It's just that you lose the extra interest rate. Okay, and we invest the savings in an electric infrastructure fund. I think it makes sense because it actually reassures people that the infrastructure they need to run their EV will be available thanks to the program. Okay, and it's useful because it's cheap. It costs a tenth of current subsidies. As I said, it lives within the marketing budget. It lives completely within the marketing budget of car manufacturers. And it's cheap because the objective is different from current subsidies. Current subsidies, they're trying to move the margin on a very difficult decision, right? On a decision people don't want to do. People want to delay buying a car, and you're trying to get them to buy now. Here, I'm just asking people to tell you, oh yeah, I'm going to buy something that's low emissions in the future. The value of this is to create a strong signal of future demand. But it's also not completely insignificant in terms of infrastructure. So at the scale of 1 million people, signing up for this, so basically half of car demand, that generates a stable 12 billion euro investment fund that you can use for infrastructure. It's not a big number, but it's something, right? So that's part of the plan. It's better if government participates in communication and funding. I've been talking to car manufacturers. It's something that lives within their marketing budget. The question is how effective it can be.
So it could be a car manufacturer, the car association could.
I think it needs to be done at the level of a plurality of car manufacturers because I can commit that I'm going to want to buy an EV in the next 5 years. I can't commit which brand. So, you have a European Car Manufacturer Association that's very active. I think they should be the one carrying a project like this.
But then you have to buy from the European car manufacturer. You can't buy a Chinese car.
I don't know. I'm not going to have an opinion on this.
Everybody who participates in this scheme.
Yeah, there are legitimate opinions to be had about what industrial policy the EU should be having towards Chinese car manufacturers. I'm not the person. I don't feel educated enough to have that opinion. All right, I'm done. I've taken too much of your time. There is a website associated with the proposal. You can take a look at it. It will be linked. It's a proof of concept, really, but it's useful. And links to the survey data, both the corporate survey and the individual survey.
So thanks a lot, Sylvain. So the question is, so this was designed for France in particular, but do you think it can be applied to Europe or can it apply to the US? What about the emerging economies? Or you think that's...
I think it's great. I think it's great for all these places. So that was explicitly part of the requirements for the work, is that it had to be cheap, right? And so whether we do put, so you start, France is small in the greater scheme of things, right? And so, the way it has positive externalities on this is through, technological innovation or political innovation. And so that's the reason all these policies are meant to be cheap. All of them can be adopted by, all of them can be adopted because they're relatively cheap. They can even be adopted by places whose current electricity grid is pretty carbon intensive, right? And that's the point of keep and cut. The keep and cut part of the policy plan, they work even if your carbon intensity is currently quite high.
But if you're in an emerging economy where the current car stock is fairly low and people become richer and actually there's mostly new cars, then I guess the keep is less of an issue.
Yeah, I mean, that are sort of difficult questions at the margin. So, where, again, I don't feel completely equipped to talk about. So, you could think of banning used car exports. The UNEP has a very good report in 2020 on the damages caused by used car exports, because when you export a car from France to, some place where it's going to be reused, typically it's going to have a lot longer shelf life where it's going to be reused because labor costs and maintenance costs are lower. And so it could make sense, but it's also a big redistribution thing where, you're basically hurting a poor French person and you're hurting, a middle income person from Kazakhstan. Okay. Right? And so I don't know how to make these calls. I don't know how to make these calls.
Yes. There's a trade-off.
Yeah.
We figured out. Thanks a lot, Sylvain. And it was great. And it's useful to use your creative mind to solve real-world problems. I appreciate this very much. And this is actually a way, as you said, it's very cost-effective. It helps the environment at the same time. It doesn't cost a huge amount and gives a new way forward. That's good research, applied research. I like it a lot. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Markus.
Bye. Thanks for participating. See you soon. Bye-bye.